Well, Hans, thanks so much for taking some time to hang with us today. It's great to be with you.
David, this is amazing. Thank you so much. I appreciate coming on your show.
Yeah, now before we dive into your backstory of consciousness, mindfulness, and so forth, I want to hear, when did you first come to believe that humans are not alone in the universe? When did that first thought come into your mind?
I would say at a young age, I was in the era when Star Wars came out, and so I actually saw Empire Strikes Back first, and it scared me to death. Darth Vader scared me, and so it implanted that idea of maybe there are other civilizations out there. Growing up in Nepal, a little bit about my background, I was immersed a lot in the Mahabharata at a very young age. And so hearing those stories, hearing the legends and lores of the Kathmandu Valley, about the Yeti, all these things really inspired a lot of my imagination in a sense, going into these topics. But it wasn't until I started experiencing seeing craft and having, out of body or missing time experiences that I started to really say there's something here. And so that would have been, after 1998 through present day. So I've experienced a lot of interesting phenomena, and it just makes you wonder. It's a really interesting question. What are we alone? Well, as Carl Sagan always put it, if we find just one piece of bacteria outside of Earth in space, then life is teeming in the universe. And in 1975, on the Viking missions to Mars, they discovered a bacterial wiggle, and they discovered water vapor in the atmosphere around the poles. And
Hmm.
so it's interesting that we keep going back there going, we've discovered water for the first time, but in 1975, they had already discovered that. And so with that alone, it's like, well, of course, we can't possibly be alone. I mean, there's so many billions and billions of stars that have habitable zones around them that the possibility of how life exists here could also exist elsewhere.
You just mentioned your upbringing in Nepal, which is so interesting. I believe you were there from age 4 to 19. What brought you there, and what was it like now then transitioning at the age of 19 to a different country? I can't even imagine that. But like,
Wow, that's the golden question. So I'm what you consider a third culture kid. So I was raised in one culture. I was born to one culture. I was raised in another culture, and through that, I experienced multiculturalism. My father had gone to Nepal in the 1960s. He was in Group Two of the Peace Corps, and so he was there. I think it was 1963 to 1965. And then he went back and did his doctoral dissertation in anthropology. He spent a year in a very remote Gurung village way up in the Manang Valley and studied pretty much the village caste system. And then when I was 4, my father brought my sister, myself, and my mom back to Nepal. And I pretty much lived there off and on until I was 19. And then I went back when I was 21 to do a thesis study in Bhutan, very intense 2-month study in Bhutan. And prior to that, I had done a 6-month internship for large format printing in Kathmandu. So a good chunk of that, yeah, 12 years. I grew up in Kathmandu, and it wasn't so much a culture shock at the age of 4. I was speaking Nepalese. I was very immersed in the culture, and so for me, that was what I was used to.
mhm.
The culture shock is what we would call reverse culture shock. Was coming back to the Pacific Northwest, where I live now, for university. I decided to go to art school. I wanted to become a designer and an illustrator. And I figured, oh, at art school, people will be into the, my travel tales and some of my upbringing. But the complete opposite was true, because most of the people I had met, and this was, 1998, this is pre-internet in a sense, had never traveled. And we didn't have armchair tourists at that point. And so their stories were more revolved around politics and revolved around TV shows I could care less about, and sports that I never grew up watching. And so there was this big, headbutt of information going on between me and my peers until I started incorporating some of my multiculturalism into the art that I was producing at the university. And people lit up and were like, wow, this is so different from what we're used to. And so it kind of started bridging that gap for me. But the reverse culture shock is very real, because I was on Jimmy Church's show recently, and he's like, you lived in a a 1,000+ year old civilization. And then you come back to the States, and we've only been around for the last 200 years. We don't really have a culture here. We're kind of a hodgepodge of, multiculturalism of itself nowadays. But the U.S. isn't that old. And so living in a country like Nepal that, stretches back thousands of years, there's such a difference between,
Hmm.
what I grew up with and what I see around me here.
Hmm. How would you describe, I almost hear that you had there was a richness to the texture of
Yes.
life that you were living
Yes.
versus like a shiny varnish of pop culture.
America, hey, yeah. Very, very, very much so. I mean, a lot of the houses, it's brick and mortar in Nepal, but you go into the villages and they're building their houses out of mud, and they have this yearly tradition of remudding their houses and rebuilding and cleaning out, and everything deals with some sort of aspect of spirituality, in a sense, where every season has its own, specific holiday. I mean, we kind of do this in the West, but we've hallmarkified it, but there it's very real. And so they've just got done with a fall harvest festival called Dashai. During Dashai, they bring out these giant swings, they bring out bands, everybody celebrates. They slaughter a buffalo, a chicken, or a goat, depending on your status level. Everybody in the village shares. I mean, it's an amazing event because it brings on the blessings for a new harvest the next year. So reap, sow. And so
Hmm.
this is that. And then from that they go into Diwali or Tihar, which is the light festival. And this is when everybody gets married and everything's strung with lights, and everybody lights candles around their rooftops on their houses. And it's just like you said, it's a rich texture of culture. And it's hard to describe unless you actually go there. And so I always tell people, get out of the office, get on a plane, spend the money. We have a short life on this planet. Go do things that'll enlighten you and make you light up. Go see the world. And so, yeah,
Yeah, I've been to myself India a dozen times, and primarily to rural villages, and so
right.
I have seen the mudding of the homes and the flooding that happens, and the thatched roof, and the tribe that goes out and gets the rats out of the field, and the rice paddies, and
Yep.
it's just an amazing difference. Now in Nepal and Bhutan, is that primarily Muslim, or what's the religious makeup
So
there?
Nepal is interesting because it's a mixture of Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism.
Okay.
But you also find Jain, Baha'i, Judaism, Christianity.
Hmm.
There's a lot of Jesuits that started the school systems there, and
Hmm.
so it's this hodgepodge of every religion, as I like to say, you can shake a stick at.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of a pick or choose. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful expressions in all religions and all philosophies. It's just how do you navigate that? And so the international school I was going to, for example, K through 12 had 300 students and 72 nationalities. And so you're surrounded by a world of culture, and everybody's a tight knit family because the school system is so small.
Hmm.
And so that to me was like the biggest gift, because I got to learn so much about other people and other countries and other cultures. And I'm still friends with, the majority of the people I went to school with, and they live all over the world, and to me, that's amazing because if I want to travel, I can kind of, go visit my friends, and they'll show me the true, aspects of where they live versus the tourist aspects. A lot of people just want to go live in a hotel for a week and sit by the
Right.
swimming pool, and it's like, why? Go see the rest of the country.
Yeah, yeah. So you're growing up in this multicultural experience. What was your introduction to whether it was religion, spirituality, consciousness, mindfulness? How did that all kind of flow from your childhood into adulthood?
I think that had a lot to do with the international, the expat community here, because a lot of people were into yoga and they were into their own spiritual aspects. Just living in Nepal, you're surrounded by ashram after ashram. There's a lot of monks. There's a lot of meditation, and there's a lot of, how do we describe, a new age community, or people that are open minded in a sense, that come there looking for answers. And so I've always found that fascinating. I've always loved to meet these people. I love to socialize and go out on the town and just meet tourists. And where are you from? What do you do? What are you here for? Can I help you and show you things of Kathmandu that you would never see? Because, I've got a car and pick you up at the hotel after breakfast, and we'll go to the backside of Pashpati and we'll meet a yogi that's there, and we'll chat with him for several hours, or we'll do something else, just things that most tourists don't get to see. And so through that, you kind of have a cultural exchange, and you learn more about other people's philosophies and other people's spiritual aspects. And so I would say I was immersed in it at a very young age, but more so when I was in middle school and high school, because that was when I was starting to become aware of myself and my own surroundings of where I was
Mhm.
living. So yeah,
And then when you came to the United States, how did your spirituality like shift or morph, or did it stay the same?
it shifted. I had to shift, as said, because I was going through reverse culture shock when I got back to the States. Um, and so I kind of bottled that up, and I did my art, and I wanted to become a graphic designer and an illustrator. And I got in a horrific car accident. I got T-boned at an intersection on my bicycle,
Hmm.
and it took me out. And I had a very prolific client who was an osteopath from Germany, and he said, "You need to get into deep tissue Chinese needle acupuncture." God, where am I going to find that here? Well, I happened to be going back to Nepal that summer. And so I went through Thailand, and I had a procedure done at the Bumrungrad International Hospital for deep tissue Chinese acupuncture. The needles are, 4 inches long and 10 gauge. And I went from being partially paralyzed on my left hand side to playing basketball at, at the hotel that evening. And I stopped and I thought, and I went, there's something to this. There's something to our own energy work, our own spirit that allows us to heal through different modalities that are outside of pharmaceutical, or if we slash the P because it's silent, it's pharmaceutical, right? And so getting into some of these Eastern, modalities of healing, it really, brought me back into my spiritual self. And I had a lot of downtime. I had lost my job at the time. I had lost my insurance. And so I started immersing myself in every documentary I could find, read, discover about these topics, spirituality, consciousness, the potential of extraterrestrial life, ancient civilizations and cities. And so I started really getting into these topics. And then fortunately later in life, I met people like Brian Forrester and Patricia Iowan Lehman. And I started doing flyers and posters for them and getting into what they're doing in Peru and Egypt. And it just all started compounding into more and more research. And I love going into my research with my BS meter completely in the red and hundreds of questions. But then, the idea is going into the field and actually seeing these places. And then your BS meter is completely shattered and you come back with thousands of questions and just more and more research. And so this is what I started driving, a lot of my research outside of being a graphic artist around. And so, yeah, I got into a lot of it back then due
Talk to
to an
me.
accident.
Yeah, that's amazing. Talk to me about your work and study and research in Dropa Stones, which I didn't even, some of these things are new for me and our listeners. What are Dropa Stones? How did you get interested in this? Like, walk us through this.
So I did my thesis in Bhutan in 1998. I went there to study Buddhist cultural mysticism, ancient art, and architecture, because after China invaded Tibet in the 1950s, Bhutan was one of the last resorts for some of the oldest Buddhist art and artwork and architecture. I also was very interested in their lores and legends and mysticism, because in Bhutan they have a very specific sect of Buddhism called Nyingma Buddhism. And this is where we get the stories of levitation, magic, sorcery, astral projection, ascended Tulku masters, Mount Meru, the connections to Sirius, to telepresence, communication with other worlds. This all comes out of this very small sect of Buddhism. The rest of Buddhism kind of glazes over it. They don't really talk about it, but this sect does. And so I was very fascinated with this. And so while I was there, I started researching, and I came across a nomadic tribe of people called the Drokpa. And I didn't think anything of it. And I came back, did my thesis, graduated, got into my design field. And around 2005, I watched a documentary on the History Channel called The UFO Files, starring David Sereda, Richard Dolan, and Hartwig Hausdorff. And they were talking about this race of people coming out of central China called the Dropa. And the way it was being described and the story that they were going through flashed me back to this, my thesis in 1998 and meeting this very intricate group of nomadic people. They're short in stature, they have blue eyes, they have this very rich orangish complexion to them, oftentimes auburn hair. They don't speak Tibetan, they don't speak Nepalese, they don't speak Hindi. They speak a language that's 3,000 years older than Sanskrit called Shina, and it's Shina Brokskat, Brokat, or Minoriskat. And this transliterates across the region from central China, which was far eastern Tibet, all the way through Bhutan, or Tibet, Bhutan, northern India, Nepal, Ladakh, into Kashmir, up into Turkmenistan, around the Caspian and Black Sea area. And the name of the group goes from the Dropa in far eastern Tibet to the Zopa, Dzopa, in the central Tibetan region, to the Drokpa of Bhutan and Nepal, northern India, to the Brokba of the rest of the region. And they
Hmm.
all are part of this nomadic enclave of, small statured people that just they don't fit in. They're very odd. And so I started thinking, oh my God, my dad's doing tours and treks in Bhutan. Maybe I can go on a trek in 2005 with him and get some blood samples and figure out, what the haplogroup of these people are and where they come from. Because there was a lot of research being done around the elongated skulls at this time as well. And people were trying to get DNA evidence of the elongated skulls. Brian, since that, has done that, which is amazing. But it just started sparking my fascination. And then my dad was like, "We'll have no bloodletting on my tours." And so it was kind of out the window there. And so I kind of forgot about the topic. And around 2018, another researcher kind of challenged me to look into the Dropa Stones. I'd never really looked into the story or considered it. And after going back and looking online and trying to find as much information as I could, I wanted to either debunk it or go deeper down the rabbit hole with it. And I just started finding the same information over and over and over and over and over again. And I
And tell
realized.
us tell us what they are, just for people who have never heard
So
of
the
them
Dropa
before.
stones are circular discs. They look a lot like Chinese bidiscs, which is interesting because we don't really know what Chinese bidiscs are for. They're about this big. They have a circular hole in the center. And from them is two lines of spiraling glyphic writing that comes off of the disc. In the story, there's only one disc that has writing on it, but we learn of a potential of 716 discs in total being found. But we're never told whether or not they have writing on them. Only one disc does. And so the baseline
And
story is that
when were they found?
so they were found in 1938 in this remote region of what then would have been far eastern Tibet. The region is called Bayan Kara Ula and the Bayan Harshan mountain range. And so Bayan Kara Ula is one of the mountains there. Um,
Do we physically
Basically,
have them in our possession as
this is
humans right now?
this is a question. There is a good possibility of that. Um, this whole area is littered with caves. A lot of these caves are very dry because of the aridness of the region. And in these caves in the past, they've found manuscripts, they've found petroglyphs, they've found mummified remains like the Tarim mummies, which are close to, 4000 BC, somewhere around that range. Expertly preserved, red hair, blue eyes, short in stature, orangish golden skin. But in the 1930s, a lot of this information wasn't discovered or even known. And so this archaeologist from the Beijing Academy of Sciences goes into this region with his team, and they discover a cave that has a burial within it, petroglyph on the wall showing a possibility that these people came from the Sirius star system, because Canis Major, as a constellation seen from Earth, is on the wall with a dotted line going to a mountain range. And they find row upon row of mummified and skeletal remains, short in stature, about 4 foot, slightly elongated heads, or as Hartwig Hausdorff likes to put it, they had huge, clumsy heads. But they also had the remnants of this blue eyes, auburn hair, and this orangish, complexion. And amongst them, they found one of these discs. And 20 years after that, the disc is supposedly translated. How do you translate an alien glyph, when you don't have a cipher? And the story just kind of fizzles and disappears after that. One of the discs ends up in Russia and the Soviet Union for further testing. So they do mineralogic tests and harmonic oscillation or quantum harmonic oscillation. So they'll basically attach electrodes to it and pulse energy or electricity through it and see if it holds a charge. The mineralogical tests came back as showing that they were made up of basically, my disc here is jade. So this is a red jade. It's a softer, soapier stone. It's easier to carve, but the disc in particular was made up of jadeite. And so jadeite is a form of granite that has jade crystalline mass within it, but it also has other materials, micromaterials like mercury and cobalt can also be found in jadeite. And so, based on the quantum oscillation testing, it came back that it not only held a charge, but it had been holding a charge for a very long time. Well, in 1966, Mao launches his Cultural Revolution in China. They either destroy, hide, or remove Chinese cultural history, and most of it was destroyed. And so a lot of it ended up in private collections or left China, if at all. What remains, we don't really know. Unfortunately, we found a lot of sites since then that have made archaeology in China very fascinating, like the Shangxing Dui site and some of the pyramids around Sichuan area. Um, but around the 1980s, some of these discs started popping up in museums, like the Bompo Museum in Sichuan, China. And so the question is, what are these discs? The Chinese don't even really know because most of them are unmarked, and so there's a possibility that they could be related to this Drokpa culture. And it's been very difficult to find a lot more information. But I started scratching the surface. I started looking into the sources in this 2005 documentary of where they were saying the information came from. And I discovered that most of those sources, I could not find even evidence that they existed. And so I kept researching and kept researching and kept researching. And I stumbled across a German article from 1965 and an article in Sputnik magazine from 1967 that pretty much mirrored each other and described the cultural archaeologist finding the site. It described this other gentleman translating the discs. And it also gave the translation of what was on the disc. And it's incredibly fascinating because it talks of this group of Dropa coming down from the clouds in their craft and crash landing on Earth and being witnessed by the locals of the area. The dates are questionable because in the translation it says that they've come before, so they've come a second time, which means that they possibly had come twice. And
Hmm.
so to me, that's fascinating because that also ties into the story around the Dropa that they possibly had showed up 10,000 years ago and also possibly about 1,000 years ago on a return trip. And so there's a whole story around this. Of course, I'll be talking about this at Conscious Life Expo in full detail. But it's very interesting because a lot of what the translation would be, to me, seems like it had come from the observers of the crash, not so much from the people in the crash. And so if you're looking at alien script or this, it's very hard to decipher. But if you're looking at glyphic writing outside of Chinese glyphic writing, then that would be an alien script to somebody trying to translate it. But it's a regional language that eventually could, the code could be cracked around.
My
Oh,
goodness. Okay,
these are the
so there's
Dropa Stones.
yeah. So we don't necessarily, we may or may not have them in our possession because
Correct.
they may not have the writing. So it may just look like a stone, like you're holding up, but not have some sort of alien writing on it.
Correct.
So we're not quite sure. So there are people in my very limited perusal that would say this is all just a myth. This is all just made up.
Hmm.
This is like, what would you say to that? And I obviously, you've got a whole book on it called Dropa Legends and Lore. We'll put a link in the show notes for people to get a hold of that. But what would you say to people who go, this is just a made up story?
So this goes back into my thesis. And so studying Buddhist culture mysticism, I started learning about my teacher, Tashila, who was my translator. He would translate from Tibetan into Nepalese and English. I speak Nepalese and English. And basically translate the stories on all the walls of the ancient monasteries. And he saw that I sparked up when he started talking about ascended masters and ascended Tulku masters. And so these are people that have mastered, you know, prowess of mind, body, and spirit. They're enlightened beings. They're bodhisattvas in their own. In other words, they've, instead of going on to become light astral beings, they've stayed through compassion to help the rest of us through our suffering because they've gone through enlightenment within one lifetime. And so there are these master Buddhist monks that are like this. And they also have mastered the spiritual meditational technology, and I have to claim it as that, of astral projection. We think of technology as nuts and bolts, our cell phones and our earphones, but fire is a technology. Why? Because we've mastered it through practice. Meditation and deep meditation and transcendental meditation is a technology because through practice, you can master it. Yoga is a technology because through practice, you can master it to a level that it changes the dynamics around you. And so in these traditions, they talk about these ascended masters having the ability to astral project either their consciousness, their physical energy form, or their physical form through the dimensions of time and space to other realms, planets, solar systems, galaxies, the universe. And so it's interesting that you had brought up a question in our show notes about dimensional or extra dimensional beings around aliens coming here or extraterrestrial life coming here. And this is fascinating because if we have this ability to astral project ourselves to other realms, we then would be the interdimensional travelers. And
Hmm.
so what's to say that they can't also perform the same task? So we can come here with nuts and bolts technology, get on great ships and fly across the universe. We can come here through an astral form where we take over somebody else's consciousness, or we appear to somebody as a vision or consciousness on the astral plane. We can do projected panspermia, where you plant a microbe of DNA in a spore, and it ends up on an asteroid that smashes into a life-giving planet. Or we can kind of have a combination of this, which is interesting because just recently SETI has announced that they've decoded this huge chunk of a radio projection that came here. And just yesterday, they had another huge announcement. But in 2017, they were talking about every 52 minutes, they would get these pulse bursts from another section of the galaxy. And then in 2018, NASA announces, hey, we've discovered synthetic DNA, and we're using this to discover extraterrestrial life. And so I automatically think about the movie Contact. We're sent, these radio signals to build a device, a Merkabah device, to take our consciousness through an astral projection technology to Vega to have a 13 or 39-hour conversation with, an extraterrestrial race that here on Earth takes place in the blink of an eye. And so to me, it's fascinating because, well, what's coming through these radio signals? And if we have synthetic DNA, we can build a synthetic being that then can have a telepresence put within it. And now we're decoding, this other stuff from SETI, and they're talking about it being DNA strands being sent through radio waves. And I was just at my lecture event at Alien Event in Vegas, and I brought up radio waves in one of the panels that I was on, and Mike Barra was like, "Well, why would aliens be sending us radio waves?" Well, Mike, we're sending them radio waves. So why not communicate in the method of receival? And so, yeah, I would say looking into Buddhism and seeing that even in their own literature, they talk about conscious astral projection and physical astral projection to places like Sirius, of all places, usually using this dimensional portal of Mount Meru. Mount Meru is attached through the chakra points of the earth as dimensional portals. And the crown chakra, the summit, connects to Sirius through a rainbow bridge. And so this is interesting because the Rainbow Bridge is a metaphor for the Milky Way, which, stems from the highest mountains in the world all the way into the east, down on the horizon where Sirius rises. But we also have Norse mythology that talks about the Rainbow Bridge, the Bifrost that connects the nine realms. And so this is interesting that this overlaps into Buddhism. Well, if we're talking about a culture coming out of central, China, far eastern Tibet, that is related either through a hybrid status or its own cultural status to the Buddhists and the Tibetans of the region, the Han Tibetans, but also have extraterrestrial roots, this is fascinating. And there is definitely something there about it. And you look into some of these legends and lores, even in Japanese culture and a lot of Chinese culture, and it even confirms that even more because they're talking about, visitation and beings and learning guided knowledge from astral beings that have come to them. So yeah, I would say there is definitely a case for something around this level because we're not the only ones talking about it in modern times. We have cultures talking about it in the past.
Hmm. What are some of the misconceptions about extraterrestrial life that you hear in culture and in the conversations that you're having that you feel like need to be realigned, corrected in some way?
Ooh, don't want to step on people's toes. There's a lot of intriguing conversations around extraterrestrial life that I've been involved in, and then there's a lot of what I would call hokey mystery in a sense. And so,
Such as, give me an example, because I'm not
well,
a part of these conversations, so I
I'm
wouldn't
I'm not
be
so
privy
much.
to.
I'm more into the research, but so I'll give you an example of experience. So a lot of people will talk about being abducted or having out of body experiences or being visited by the grave or the Venusians or the Andromedans, and it's the same story that just keeps being rinsed and repeated and rinsed and repeated and rinsed and repeated to a point of eye rolling. It's like, oh, is this even real? We don't really know. But then other experiencers, myself, I have like a 5 hour time gap missing from when I lived in Hawaii. I was staring. I was at a house party. My friend's band was playing. We were all eating this amazing deer meat and just having a good time, sitting by the fire, chatting. Staring into the Milky Way as you do when you live on Hawaii because it's just right there in front of you and there's no light pollution around you. And my girlfriend's like, Hans, it's time to go. And I'm like, well, we just got here. We were hanging out with friends. And she's like, no, you've just been staring into space for 5 hours. I haven't been
Wow.
able to move you or anything. You're not here. And I went, wow, that this literally was a minute ago. So I've had experiences like that. But when I was in Egypt in 2018, we were all sitting on top of the Nile cruise. It's great because you're on the Nile. It kind of mimics the Milky Way as well. And there's no light pollution there either. And it's getting toward dusk, and a few of us are, having a beer, having a conversation on the roof. And Brian Forrester's wife Irene goes, look, and this orb flies by, flashing blue, orange, white lighting. It was just like swirling orb, flies by the boat, followed by two F-15s. And then about 30 seconds after that, another orb kind of flies by and just bounces along as if to say, hello, here we are. And so Irene got a photo of it, and we were all just sitting there dumbfounded because what are we looking at? And so this could be interdimensional travel. This could be, an orb of sorts, or it could be our own technology training our pilots. Because in essence, drones or drone crafts they don't have to worry about the G forces that a pilot pushes themselves to their envelope through to be a successful pilot or a dogfighter or a test pilot. And so if we can use these drones to, cut that edge even closer, I think it's pretty amazing technology. But what do we know? I mean, there's been a lot of release in the news recently. There's been a lot of agencies trying to get a hold of the narrative and control the narrative. And so the ultimate question is, what are the aliens here? Are we the aliens here? I mean, look at us. We clothe ourselves. We all have poor eyesight. We have our internal clock doesn't quite work with the 24-hour system of Earth. It's a little bit longer. We tear down nature to recreate nature, right? No other animal does this on this planet. And we're also the only animal that doesn't really have night vision, which is interesting because most of the animals have night vision. And so we have 300 or 180 degree sound or hearing. There's so much about us as a human species on this planet that doesn't jive well with this planet. It really beggars the question, are we even from here? Where are the different sectors of people from on this planet? And how long have we been here? I mean, nobody really knows. Of course, we share, DNA with this planet. Why wouldn't we? If we were to terraform some other planet, we would have to upgrade their DNA, kind of like in the movie Pandorum, to fit, the circumstances of wherever we go out in space. And so there's this way that we would figure out how to adapt ourselves. And so this is a good question. And yeah. So you go from the hokey where, the story is just rinsed and repeated to, actual visitation or technology. And it would be nice for them to roll out, whether it's a synthetic DNA or whether it's an actual live being, roll it out. And, I think we're ready. I mean, we've been conditioned through the movies, through the Brookings Institute, through all these, programs that have been rolled out in the last 5 to 10 years. It's the drip, drip, drip of disclosure has gone to a steady stream. And so those people looking into these topics, yeah, I mean, there definitely is something there. Some of the topics, as I said, I don't necessarily agree with. I'm not super into people that channel things, but everybody's got their niche. So
Talk to me about that, because obviously at Conscious Life Expo, there's a lot of channeling that's going on. I talk
right.
to a lot of people that channel. What about that does not resonate with you?
Some of it does. Some of it definitely does. But again, it gets into this. How does there's another researcher, he calls it UFO syndrome. It's like you have to constantly keep reinventing yourself. And for me, I just want to get into the research. I'm more into the, nuts and bolts of the research. I'm not into, oh well, I'm gonna, extrapolate this huge story about some experience or, what I think I know about these topics, even though I've never experienced them myself. And so yeah, channeling is it's fascinating on many levels. And then sometimes you just get that pinprick, on the back of the neck or that gut reaction where you go, I don't really resonate with this. There's something about it that doesn't gel with me.
Fascinating. If the general public came to believe, like everybody believes, that alien life is 100% verifiable. Now, some people would say that already. Like, it's 100%. Like, I believe it. Maybe it's more of a noetic kind of approach. Like, I just know.
Sure.
But like, we roll out a body. We have verifiable footage. We have an interview on ABC News. Whatever. How do you think that would impact our world? Like, what do you think would happen if we came to believe, like, yes, it's true?
Well, so this is what the Brookings Institute was tasked with in, the 60s and 50s when we started going into space, in a sense. They were tasked with, hey, if we go into space and we find artifacts, whether they're ancient, modern, ours, or somebody else's, how do we tell this to humanity? And Brookings came back and said, you can't. It would disrupt every single religion on the planet. I don't agree with that because a lot of these religions are already accepting, angelic or extraterrestrial beings coming here. It's just how you frame it, right? But in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have this interconnectivity that we have today. And I think, there's some great benefit about that because of the interconnectivity. We can all share our ideas. And I think we're coming more to a collective of understanding. But back then, we just didn't have that. And so, they were right to say that. But they said in order to truly do it, we would have to drip the information slowly and then bring it toward, a running faucet. And so how would we do this? We do it through media. So printed articles, books, movies, TV shows. And, you go from movies and TV shows and books in the 1970s and flash forward to today, and almost every other movie has some sort of alien, extraterrestrial, ghost, spirit, or some aspect to it, like almost every other movie. And so it's really amazing to see how far that drip of disclosure has come. And so I feel that society is ready. Obviously, it's going to be an odd experience for all of us because we're going to be in denial. I mean, there's no way around that. The human psyche is very much about this. All of a sudden, you're in denial. You feel guilty. You're going to go through denial. And it's like all the stages of grief in a sense. But eventually, we'll realize, wow, this is truth. I mean, we kind of already have alien life on this planet outside of my, connection with our own. We do not share DNA with the octopus or the Portuguese man of war at all. And so what are these creatures? The octopus is incredibly intelligent. It's genius level intelligence. beyond, but we can't communicate. I mean, we can't physically or harmonically communicate with an octopus, but you see what they're able to do. I mean, they can transform themselves. They can get out of small spaces. They can unscrew jar lids. They can camouflage themselves with the textures of their environment, which is fascinating. The Portuguese man of war is the other one. So the Portuguese man of war shows up on the leeward side of islands around the full moon. Nobody knows where they come from. They're a colonial organism, which means it's multiple organisms that string themselves together, and they create this balloon sac so they can float on the top of the ocean. But what are they? Where do they come from? How do they reproduce? It's a complete mystery. And so here we have two, in our definition of, alien, not so much extraterrestrial, but we have two alien creatures living on this planet with us that we don't really understand, in a sense, their origins.
Amazing. Hans, I can tell you what would happen.
Least
everybody would just go buy toilet paper. That is what would happen.
Well, so the last scenario that we went through, I think, was a huge testing bed for that, because
Yeah.
what was the secondary, aspect of COVID was disclosure. It came on the heels of it. And so it's like, okay, we rolled out this, we saw how people would react. They raided every single grocery store. Then all the toilet paper was gone, and people ran out of water, and people ran out of sanitizer. And so would people freak out in the same way and then eventually start coming out of their bubble? And as I suggested, yeah, we would go through this period of complete denial. Oh, this couldn't be happening. And then we would freak out. We'd be angry. And eventually we'd come around and go, okay, we have to accept this. And so, yeah, I think there is a rollout. They're trying to roll out this narrative and see if it sticks. And so this gets back to reality versus hokey. It's like, okay, if they're trying to have a narrative that sticks, what is their agenda? Is there money involved? Well, yeah, when Grush and Lou Elizondo came out, 2 years ago, all of a sudden Space Force was funded to the tune of billions of dollars. And so it's like, okay, we create this threat narrative and we're going to have a military, financial reaction to that. And so this is interesting that, the narrative coming out in the mainstream news is threat, 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 mystery, 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 mystery. But what if there is a benefactor element to extraterrestrial life? What if they are here to help us? What if they don't have our best intent in mind, because they see our valuable resources and they possibly see us as resources? And this is interesting because this goes back into ancient stories of visitation as well. They see us as a resource that they can utilize to get what they want out of our planet. So here we are, flash forward to today. Are the visitors coming back? Do they see us as a threat or a resource? Obviously, we're still trying to nuke ourselves to the Stone Age, which is really sad. I figured in my lifetime we would be far, far beyond that, but it seems like we get 2-3 steps forward and we keep falling back a step or two.
Well, you're going to be at Conscious Life Expo, as you mentioned, in February of next year. And so that's in Los Angeles, California. Talk to me about, what are you going to be presenting at Conscious Life Expo? How are you going to be participating?
So I'm going to be presenting, I believe it's Friday at noon in the Rabbit Hole Room, which is downstairs, which is awesome. That's the second day of the convention. I'm going to be talking about the Dropa Stones, but I also get into other legends and lore around other cultures and symbology. A little bit about my upbringing in Nepal, a little bit what got me into all these topics, and then kind of diving headfirst into my discoveries around the Dropa storyline, where it started, where my research starts to differ from the actual research that you find online that just haven't changed at all or over time, and the different elements of things that I've discovered along that journey that brought me, to my conclusions or my hypothesis around the Dropa legends and lore itself, and what's based in reality, what isn't, and where it overlaps, and how that affects the outcome of the story. It's a story that a lot of people don't talk about. There isn't a lot of cultural mysticism and extraterrestrial visitation coming out of Asia, Nepal, India. Well, India, you get a lot of the Mahabharata, but not so much Nepal, Bhutan, or Tibet. And so it's very much a new field in a sense to be getting into. And so I'm really excited to be able to share this with people. I also do a lot of topics around, as I said, symbology. And recently, I've been getting into the studies of Kemet and the Cometian life before the Greeks conquered Egypt, because there was a whole different society that lived there during that time. And unfortunately, most of what we learn about Egypt comes directly from the Greeks, the Romans, and the Arabs that had taken over from the 300 BC era forward. And so there's a rich cultural aspect and symbology aspect that goes into that as well. And so I like to kind of interweave some of these topics into one topic to bring a conscious and holistic, message across through this, and introduce people to new topics and new areas to start researching into. So yeah.
Love that. Thank you. What do you love about Conscious Life Expo? Because I know you participate regularly.
I went in 2023 for the first time, and I was blown away at how big it was. There's so many people that show up there. I believe it's the largest conference of this type in the US, possibly in the world at this point. And I was blown away with how many vendors were there and some of the most amazing technologies to look at. And just for me, it's getting out of my shell of graphic design. I can sit and yell at people all day long in front of my keyboard and not really meet or get into, other people's spaces. But when you go to a conference of this size, or even when you lecture at conferences of this size, you start meeting your people. And for me, this has been something that's been missing over the last, years. And so I'm glad that I've started going to these conferences, because I'm meeting other people that are like-minded, other people that are interested in these topics. The conversations and the caliber and cadence of these conversations have just been amazing. And this is why I go on tours. So I've been to Peru once, I've been to Egypt twice. I went to Mexico this last spring, which was amazing, first time there. And just the people you meet on the tours I mean, we're all there for the same purpose. And
Mm-hmm.
so it just, that ice is already cut. And so you can start having these incredibly intellectual conversations that just go on and on and on. And you leave these conventions and you're still friends with everybody. And it's just an amazing way to network with people in the community.
I love it.
I,
All right.
I encourage everybody to go to these things. They're really worth it. And it's so much better than TV. Trust me.
That's consciouslifeexpo.com is where you can get that information and tickets. And if people want to follow your work and connect with you, what's the best place for them to reach out?
So I have two things. I'm building up my YouTube channel slowly. It's called Giza Direct on YouTube. I have a lot of not documentaries, lectures from people like Patricia Iwan, Lehman, Yusuf Iwan, Brian Forster, Hugh Newman, Andrew Collins. I've interviewed people like Brad Olson on there and Colin Wolford. And I'm starting to build that up. But the majority of my work can be found at megalithic.mysteries.com. You have links to my three books, which I'll give a quick flash here. The first is Dropa Legends and Lore. Um, the second is The Magic of Symbols, which is an introductory to symbology throughout the ages. And the third is my Lost Mysteries of Kemet. And so these three can be found with links to where you can purchase them on my website. I also design fashions, and so I have a lot of my sublimation fashions on there as well, and stories of my tours to Peru and Egypt. And I will be updating some of my past stuff living in Nepal and Bhutan. And there's other links to lectures and stuff that I've been involved with. But megalithic.mysteries.com. You can find my books at lulu.com. Just look under the titles or go to Megalithic Mysteries and click on the links.
Hans, if I'm at a party, which I probably wouldn't be because party's not really my thing, but if I'm there, if I got dragged to one, I'm always looking for the person that want to like corner, kind of get them in a corner and like, interview them and connect. And you would be that guy. I'd be like, I'm hanging out with this guy the whole party. All right. This is going to be fun. So
I tend to get that from people, but I appreciate that. Yeah. I can
thank
tell
you so
stories
much.
forever, which is I think the plus. I
I
appreciate
love it.
this time, John, David. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hans. It's great to be with you.
Likewise.